everybody, welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. It is Dan, back with another exciting show for you. And this week, I am excited because I have on someone that I have admired. He doesn't know this yet. I didn't even tell him. For somewhere around 25 years now, I've read most of his books, not all of them. And he's someone that has been a leader in speaking out on men's issues for those 2 decades plus. And I'm just truly honored to have him on the show. We're going to be talking about a lot of things, but primarily we're going to be talking about the issues that men and boys face and delving into a little bit of stuff that normally we don't cover on the show, but we'll get to that. So let me bring my guest on. He is the one, the only Mr. Stephen Baskerville. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you.
So Stephen was the ex-president of ACFC, if I said that right, which is how I first got to know him. And then I read his book called Taken into Custody. And we'll get into that a little bit. It's ballpark, 15 or so years old now, but I think it's just as valid today as it was back then, perhaps more so. But before we get into that, Mr. Baskerville, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm an academic. I work at the moment at a university in Warsaw, in Poland. And I've been working in universities for about 35 years. I've wrote most of those books when I was working in the United States at a variety of institutions. I might add that those books cost me a couple of academic jobs. It's not really very safe to write about these things. I think it's virtually impossible that I would ever work in the academic world in the United States ever again as a result of that. Because there is, as you probably know, a virtual news blackout on these issues. Mm-hmm. And so I've been, I started writing about these things, as you say, about 25 years ago. In the late 90s, I devoted all my attention to it from about the late 90s onward. And I found that I was basically blackballed, ostracized from the academic profession in the United States. And that's where I've been ever since.
So I was not aware that you had lost a couple of jobs on that, but I'm also not in the least bit surprised. You know, one of the things, as someone who also speaks out on the issues that men and boys face, is they come to try and cancel me all the time. You know, there isn't a day that goes by on one social media or another that I don't get reported for the most benign of things. I've had 4 accounts banned. I mean, it's like they don't want us even talking about the issues, let alone addressing them, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is so that we can delve into some of these issues, because I do think that one of the most important things is that we do need to talk about them. We need to get it out there. One advantage of social media, I mentioned some of the negatives, but one advantage is it does give us a little bit more control of being able to get out there and speak on the issues. They're not the biggest fans of us, but it's much better than it was in trying to deal with the regular news media, as I'm sure you know. If I may ask, when you were writing those books and they blackballed you, did they even say anything to you, or did they do like they do with me, which is try and find other ways to get you without, specifically pointing to that? What was your experience with that?
Yeah, no, that's very true. They won't admit it because they're supposed to honor the concept of academic freedom, and you're not supposed to be sacked or dismissed or fired or victimized for any reason because because your research makes somebody unhappy or somebody disagrees with it. So that's a basic principle of academics, and yet they find ways to do it. You don't get your contract renewed, or you don't get tenure, or you don't get a promotion, or in one case there's always the ubiquitous excuse of budget cuts. We have to have budget cuts.
Yeah,
can't be out of the blue. So it's there's all kinds of excuses, but they find ways to do it.
Yeah, they always try to do it though without overtly saying it. I think because they want to protect themselves from any backlash on it. I see that.
Absolutely.
I see it with the media also, right? I having worked in the media, I do a radio show now. I do this. They always like you'll laugh at this one. One of the things they try and report me for is unoriginal content. I'm a talking head. It's not like I'm taking other videos and re-showing them or anything. And yet the social medias often will take a video down when it's me talking and giving my opinion. I always kind of chuckle about that. But it's the exciting thing that I think is I'm seeing, at least, and I wanted to get your opinion on this, is I do think we're starting to see a little bit of a turning point where these issues are at least a little bit more, for lack of a better term, tolerated and allowed to be talked about. Now you're in Europe, and I'm curious if it's different there than even in the US, but are you seeing a little bit, maybe just a little bit of more openness? And do you think there is a difference between, say, the US and Europe?
Well, if you're speaking about fathers' issues in particular, no, I don't see any real difference. There's not much interest here. I mean, it has to be said that most European countries are not as bad as the United States and Canada. I mean, in my experience, by far the worst countries in the world as far as, the rights of parents generally and fathers in particular are the United States and Canada. I mean, in terms of, locking men up for supposedly things like non-payment of child support and things like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, the U.S. and Canada are by far the worst countries. They don't even do that yet in Britain. So, in some respects, I wouldn't expect as much attention, but here, there's virtually nothing here. The European media takes its cue from the United States, and even here in Eastern Europe, the media take their cue from Western Europe and from the U.S. So it's all the mainstream media, and we see this now in the last few years with other issues with things like the MAGA phenomenon and the war in Ukraine and the January 6th and Donald Trump and all this. The media just black out what they don't want to report, and it's no different really than in the U.S.
It's my experience, because I do a live show on Wednesdays and I have people from all around the world, and it mirrors what you were talking about. I had somebody just kind of chirp in from Bulgaria last week, and he was saying what you're saying is in the U.S. is happening here. The U.K., I hear it all the time from the guys in the U.K. The U.K. follows the U.S. and Canada's lead pretty much. A little bit of a lag behind it, a few months perhaps, but I do. One thing that I was encouraged by, and is at least in the UK, and I know they've been trying to do the same in the US, is the UK is trying to get a minister for men. There's a pretty vocal group. They're not getting anywhere because obviously the feminists don't want that, even though there's been a minister for women for over a decade now. And I know people like Dr. Warren Farrell and others have tried to get an office for men, which is a parallel or equivalent to the office for women that exists, and gotten nowhere. But, whereas I saw 10 years ago, they wouldn't even allow us to talk about it. At least, I'm not trying to say it's big. It's very tiny. I think there's a little bit of movement. And, it begs the question, and having read your book many years ago, with regard to fathers, and I have made this argument many times on this show that I can trace every societal ill that exists right now back to fatherlessness, and how society, the government, women's groups, the whole gamut of them have actively worked to eliminate fathers, to basically turn them into wallets. And I remember when I was reading Taken into Custody, you were going down that path 15 years ago, and I don't think it's changed much. What were you seeing then, and what are any differences, if any, that you're seeing now?
I don't really see any differences. I think it's nothing has changed since I wrote Taken into Custody, as far as I can tell. I mean, in some aspects of the the kind of radical sexual agenda has gotten more mainstream attention in some respects. For example, when I published that book in 2007, transgenderism was not a big issue yet. Mm-hmm. And even same-sex marriage was only starting to become an issue. So in those respects, those kinds of issues have become more salient, more prominent. and they've been taken up by these, so-called pro-family, usually Christian groups. So that, but I regard those matters as somewhat fringe, and I don't think they're actually even that important. But you can see that this kind of radical sexual ideology has become more extreme, if you like, more, it's gotten more far out on the left, and it's the battlegrounds over things like transgenderism and but it really hasn't. Those things are symptoms, much more than they are the heart of the problem, and they're simply the outgrowth of the kind of politics that fathers in particular, have been experiencing for much longer. So, I guess my point is my feeling is that because this has been unaddressed, because the things that I tried to say and taken into custody and what others have tried to say in similar writings 15, 20 years ago, because those things were ignored, unaddressed, then the sexual radicals, the radical sexual ideology, has only become more extreme or more kind of crazy in some ways. But the essence of it really is just as bad as ever, like you say. The social ills, the social pathologies, which can be attributed to fatherlessness, and we were saying this 15, 20 years ago. These things were already being said. But you hear them more and more nowadays. People like Tucker Carlson say it, Larry Elder, a whole bunch of, I compiled in my new book a bunch of websites where these conservative Candace Owens, they all come out with these sound bites saying fatherlessness is the problem, fatherlessness is the heart of all social ills. And they're right about this. And to this extent, they're correct and they're forthright. But they won't take the next step and say, yes, but the obvious next question, what is the cause of fatherlessness? And they don't want to go on about that. They don't want to say it. They won't say a word about that.
Or they take the other tack, because Vivek Ramaswamy went, and I don't know if you saw this, but back in, I think it was January, he was on a podcast, and one of his solutions to fatherlessness was to force men to pay child support in utero. And I'm like, that's fraught with issues, but how does that address anything, right? You're trying to get points with the women. I get that. I understand it from a political perspective and trying to get elected. I get that part of it. But you're not helping families. You're not helping children, and you're certainly not helping, I would argue, both men and women. But yet,
that's correct. In fact, I show in my book, and in all my books I touch on this, the child support just simply makes the system worse. It's, again, the old thing, your child support is just another subsidy on single motherhood, just like welfare is a subsidy on single motherhood. And as Ronald Reagan pointed out, if you subsidize something, you get more of it. So the child support's only going to make it worse. And I think Vivek lost a lot of support on that. I think men are one of his natural constituencies, as they are for Donald Trump. We see now black men, especially, moving toward Donald Trump, and Vivek, and I think he lost that. He lost me. He lost a lot of men by that kind of naked pandering to the feminists. And,
without question, I was a huge supporter of his. I had, for lack of a better term, I was drinking the Kool-Aid, right? I mean, I had some issues with some of it, but my argument has always been, if you can find 70, 75, 80% common ground, I can support that politician. And I was there with him. And then he came out with that, and he lost me. And I'll tell you, as someone with, it's not a huge following on social media, but a pretty decent one, he lost men. That was a very good point you made. And, he's up for consideration as VP. And I'm like, how can I vote for someone that is overtly stating, I'm going to blame men for men struggling? Doesn't make sense.
You're exactly right about that. My theory about notice too that in contrast with some politicians who simply stay silent about it. In other words, like Trump. Trump doesn't defend men or criticize the family courts, but he also doesn't condemn them. And my suspicion is that he knows what's going on, and he doesn't want to get burned by it, but he also doesn't want to say stupid things. I find the same thing with Tucker Carlson, for example, and some other journalists. he calls attention to it. His commentaries are full of little hints. And I think he knows. I think he knows what's going on in the family courts.
Mm-hmm.
And if he says it explicitly, he'll be burned and canceled, and that'll be the end of him. So he doesn't come out, he doesn't do the heroic thing, but he also doesn't do the cheap pandering that Ramaswamy did.
Right. Well, it's funny too, because I see things on the other side as well, as someone who's lobbied in both New York State and North Carolina on behalf of things like shared parenting and men's mental health, trying to raise funding for that, trying to get domestic violence shelters. I see this on the Republican side often, exactly what you're talking about. They're aware of the issues. They'll talk to you individually about them, but publicly, it's just like the third rail of Social Security. We're not going there. But I also see the same thing on the other side. One argument I've always made is neither party, at least in the United States, cares about men. Some will argue one is worse than the other. I honestly think it's 6 of one, half dozen of another when it comes to men's and boys' issues. But again, I'm reflecting back. I remember reading your book and how you were talking about how the governments, and I'll say Western governments, meaning primarily U.S., Canada, as you mentioned earlier, decided to demonize men. And it started in the 70s when they were, reforming child support. I argue it really ramped up in the 90s, during the Clinton administration, where they passed all these laws. Deadbeat dad became the in phrase. It existed. But, one question I have, and I want to get it out to you, is why? What's the benefit to the governments? You can make arguments why they did it for women and all that, but to the government, why would they think it's a good thing to demonize men?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that, and it's a very good question. And I do talk about that a little bit about that in all my books. I mean, on the one hand, there's the simple ideological matter, the pandering to the feminists, and they will criticize the feminists when it comes to things like abortion, but they won't criticize them on the fatherhood issue at all. So there's that. There's definitely the pandering. There's also there's the pecuniary interest. There's the way the money, the politicians of all political parties, especially the lawyers, are raking in the money from child support enforcement. I mean, every state in America is making a profit off child support enforcement. They get money from the federal taxpayers. Federal taxpayers are subsidizing single-parent homes through these incentive payments. And so they have actually a financial pecuniary incentive to make the fatherhood crisis as bad as possible. States don't make money on child support enforcement unless there's fatherless children. So they talk on the one hand about the crisis of fatherhood, but then they have to blame the fathers so that they can claim that the only solution is child support enforcement. And they can fill their coffers. I mean, the great example of this is Josh Hawley, who came out with this ridiculous book, which has sold, I don't know, millions of copies about, men manning up and all this, these silly phrases. And Josh Hawley was the Attorney General of Missouri. And well, the Attorney General is the main, it's the most crooked office in America, in my opinion, the state Attorney General. And anybody who's an Attorney General of an American state knows that the Attorney General, his job is to pull in as much revenue as possible from the federal government through child support enforcement. So on the one hand, he's urging men to marry, have children. And then when you do that, when you marry and have children, and your children are taken away from you by the family court, he can present you with a child support bill, and he can fill the coffers of the state with your children's patrimony. So this is unbelievably cynical. I mean, the devil, I don't know if you believe in a personal devil or not, but, a little red man with a cloven foot sitting there with a T-square couldn't come up with a more diabolical, evil system than the system of child support enforcement and child support financing. It's designed to make the fatherhood crisis as horrible as possible. And that's what it does year after year after year. And this is why it only gets worse. It never gets better. And all these politicians and journalists can fall over themselves profiting from this. And there's not a prayer that the problem is going to improve. And they're making it worse.
Yeah, it's I couldn't agree with you more because yeah, again, I speak to politicians frequently, and it's funny you're talking about attorney generals. I on my radio show that I do, we just interviewed one of the candidates for running for attorney general in North Carolina. He didn't even want to go there, right? When I started bringing this up, and I actually believe he agrees that something needs to be done, but to your very point, he doesn't want to, upset the apple cart, right? He knows you're talking billions of dollars come into states every year, and so they're incentivized, and of course most of them are attorneys, and there's that side of it too, where they're making. The last number I saw was around $4 billion a year just in attorneys' fees for divorce and family court issues, and that's why I think that's my opinion why they don't do anything about it. But when you look at society's ills now, especially the issues that you're seeing with men's mental health crisis and stuff like that, and how they completely ignore it, right? I mean, 100 plus men unalive themselves every single day. And you mentioned, for example, trans rights, and I don't want to go down that alley. People have different opinions on it, but one of the arguments they'll often make is, well, we don't want them to kill themselves. Okay, valid argument. I'll agree with you there. But a lot more men are killing themselves every single day, and you don't want to have that discussion. Why? Just your thoughts on that. Why is that side, we're worried about, I don't know what the number is, a number of people that might commit suicide as trans, which is awful, all right? I don't want anyone doing that. But it's dwarfed by the number of men every single day. We're talking thousands a year, and they don't want to have that discussion. And again, it gets back to the question. I understand the money side of it is, but something like men's mental health, they won't even address that. What's your thoughts on that?
You stated it very well. I don't know if I have anything to add to it. It's amazing. Yeah, I quote a number of scholars. There's a scholar, Augustine Kaposova, who wrote about this 15, 20 years ago, about men's suicide. He linked it directly to family court. I remember his study. It's very good. And then the media reported on it, and they completely lost it. I mean, he said he basically argued that it was the suicides were directly related to judgments from the family court. I mean, you take away a man's children, you take away his income, you throw him out of his home, you accuse him of crimes, you threaten him with prison, you turn him out on the street to a life of homelessness, and you wonder why they're killing themselves. Well, the media is pretty obvious, but then the media reported Kaposova's finding, and they said, well, it's because men aren't getting in touch with their feelings.
Yeah.
So they just trivialize it like that, and they say, well, the solution is obviously that men need more psychotherapy, they need more feminist therapists to sit on the couch and with them and talk about get in touch with their feelings. I mean, it's ludicrous. But it's been going on for 20 years that I know of.
Yeah, I mean, to your point on the therapy side of it, something in the neighborhood, last study I saw, about 40% of suicides are men dealing with divorce/family court. And shortly thereafter, like when the family breaks apart, they're dealing with it, that's when it occurs. And, you figure, let's say it's 100 men a day that are committing suicide, and 40%, that's 40 a day just because of family court. And you might quibble on some of those arguments. I actually think it's probably a higher number than that, but that's just my opinion. I have no data to support it. But it goes back to where we are as a society. And that's one of the things I wanted to explore with you is, seeing all of this over the last few decades and looking at where we are as society and seeing men withdraw from it. This is something I wanted to explore with you because you've written about it in several of your books. I think that train is now really starting to speed down the track. Men have abandoned relationships, abandoned marriage. They're flat out withdrawing from society. I actually, one of the things I've brought up many times is I think one of the biggest effects we're going to see from the pandemic is that men realized that they can do okay alone. so they don't need relationships as much, but it also exacerbated with men's mental health illnesses. And I think it's only going to get worse. I just wanted to get some thoughts from you on how that's all gone down over the decades and where we're at now. Do you see the same things?
Yeah, I do. I don't see things are much different on that. I mean, my argument now is that in many ways, what we're seeing in the last 4 years or so is that this is reaching a crisis not only for men, but for the entire society, and that the whole the fatherlessness phenomenon is responsible not only for our social ills but also for our political ills. And then a lot of this takeover of the U.S. government, basically, over the last 4 years, since the election of 2020, and even before that, since the COVID crisis in early 2020, a lot of this is directly connected with the breakdown of the family and the family court, and the machinery that is being used to go after fathers is now being used to go after people like Donald Trump and the January 6th defendants and many other people like this. So in that sense, it's not getting any better. It's getting much worse. But it may also be getting worse in such a way that the larger society starts to have reasons to pay attention to it. That they might start to sit up and say, look, this doesn't just affect a few men on the margins of society. This is affecting everybody. And this is affecting the mainstream, the politics of our society. I mean, I hate to come up with a theory of immiseration, the idea that worse is better because everybody's going to realize how awful things are and they're going to finally wake up. But I don't see anything else, any other way to wake people up to this, because the media won't do it. Even the alternative, get back to our discussion of the media, I wanted to say, that shows like this are terribly important, because the alternative media is the only voice out there that is speaking on this stuff. But even the alternative media, is not doing so in the same way that you're doing with this show. So, I would like to see Tucker Carlson, for example, take this on a little more forthrightly, or some of the other. I listened to some excellent shows. I'm very interested in the war in Ukraine. I listened to a lot of good shows, some very good shows, and analyzing the reasons for the war in Ukraine. And many of the commentators there complain about the blackout. They say there's a blackout. All you get is one side of the Ukraine war. All you get is one kind of opinion. They complain that there's a complete blackout about the fault of the U.S. Behind the war in Ukraine and what we've done to cause it and so forth. And I want to say to them, yes, you're right. There is a media blackout on that. But this media blackout has been going on about fathers has been going on a lot longer. It's probably the media blackout that served as the blueprint for all the others. It's probably the one that it was the first media blackout by the mainstream media. If you want to look around and find out, complain about media blackouts on your favorite issues, well, just look at what fathers have been going through for a quarter century, and you can see where the rehearsal, the dress rehearsal for all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to agree with you completely because it doesn't make for a great show, but I do, right? I think you're spot on. It became the blueprint. What they did. I mean, I'm 61 years old. I grew up with, men being painted as buffoons. I always talk about the Brady Bunch. The girls always beat the boys. And, that was the start of it. And then it kept ballooning. And then Homer Simpson came along and he became the definition of a father, and so on and so forth. And when you look back at things like, the media coverage and how Hollywood, the news media, all of that started portraying men and fathers, now you're seeing that happen politically, right? You kind of mentioned earlier that's how they're painting the right. It's how they're painting Donald Trump. It's how they're painting the Ukraine war even, right? To take it away from a person, but to a thing. That's a blueprint that, and let's be honest, it's worked. I mean, we have to be honest about it. We may not like it, but it has worked. And I always say it has its roots going back 100, 150 years ago, because Marx talked about it. Goebbels did it. I mean, they find that boogeyman, and men became the boogeyman first, and now you're seeing them just use that blueprint over and over again. But to get back to some of the points we've been making is society is breaking down because of it, and I wonder, do they really, they being the government, for example, do they really think that this is going to work to their benefit? I mean, I know they think they're going to get power and retain it and all that, but as we're filming this, it's a few days after Trump was convicted, and the anger that's coming out. Forget the right; you're seeing it from the center now, right? And I think that also is a blueprint. What you see happen to Donald Trump is what's been happening to fathers for decades.
Yes, very much so.
How are they not? Are they really that blind? Do you?
Well, yes, I mean, they are that blind, and they have incentives to be that blind. I've been making this point too. The media commentators, even those that express outrage about what happens to Donald Trump, and I'm thinking of people like Alan Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley, and these really very well respected and very knowledgeable experts on the legal system. And if you listen, and they're genuinely upset. I mean, they say that this is a terrible travesty of justice, what's been going on to Donald Trump, and what's been going on with the January 6th defendants before that, and the indictments that went on a year ago against Trump, and all of this. And they're very indignant. They're very upset with this. But if you listen closely to their spin, they are actually covering up more than they are revealing. Mm-hmm. What they want to do is they want to make it seem that what's happening to Trump is exceptional. It's unusual. Dershowitz says that if you're Donald Trump, you have no justice in New York. Right? He's very careful to say this. There's no justice for Donald Trump in New York. And of course, the truth is much bigger than that. The truth is there's no justice for any American in any court in the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the plain truth. This is not Donald Trump in a court in Manhattan or Donald Trump in a court in New York State. This is the breakdown of the judicial system throughout the United States. And then they turn around and they will say, if they can do this to Donald Trump, they can do this to any of us. And again, no, this is they get it exactly backwards. The point is they're doing this to Donald Trump because they've already done it to the rest of us. They've already put the mechanisms in place. They've already established the practices. They've already created the corrupt judiciary that ordinary Americans have been suffering for years. Mm-hmm. And now they're applying it to the high politics of presidential elections and Donald Trump. So it's not like this is the beginning of it and the rest of us can, expect to pay the price later. No, the rest of us have been paying the price for years. And the best example of that is family court. And now it's gotten to such an extreme state that it's actually what used to be yesterday was victimizing fathers in family court is today determining the outcome of presidential elections. So we're way past, the media pundits, even the ones that seem like the good guys who are saying all the right things. They're spinning it to protect, because I think about it, Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley and all of them they're all members of the bar associations. I mean, they have no incentive to expose this. If they did, they would be canceled. They would be stripped they would be disbarred in no time at all, and they would be turned out on the street. So they have no incentive. The best commentary I heard the other day was by Robert Barnes. He's a little more iconoclastic than the others, and he admits that this is reflective of a larger corruption in the judiciary, not just Donald Trump and not just New York State, but a larger corruption of the judiciary. But even he didn't want to dwell on it. He said it in one sentence, and then he moved on to something else. So you can see the fear in the lawyers. It's easy to demonize lawyers and judges, but to some extent they are also prisoners of the system. They live in fear also. They're well-paid prisoners of the system. They're well remunerated for their cowardice, but they are also in fear, just like the rest of us.
Yeah, like you mentioned, they talk about this as a prediction for the future. I'm like, this is the culmination of the past.
Yeah.
I didn't watch a lot of the trial. I was kind of keeping my distance from it. But the little bit I saw, I was kind of chuckling to myself, going, "This is family court every single day, and people don't know that."
Exactly.
It's
exactly anybody who's been in family court
knows
understands entirely what Donald Trump is going through. Exactly, and the January 6th attendance also.
same thing there, right? And again, it goes back to, it was the blueprint, I think, and now we're seeing the quote unquote payoff of it. But it begs the question, because seeing the blowback that's occurred, as we're filming this, I saw this morning Trump's raised something like $200 million. I think in relating it back to men's and fathers issues, I think that there's this simmering thing going on that in Trump's case has now come up. And I have to say, I think it's somewhat hopeful to me that maybe this is going to be a turning point we'll look back on 20, 30 years from now, where men woke up, right? Because let's be honest, most of Trump's supporters are men by far compared to women.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I think they're starting to find their voice. And it kind of speaks to the average man, right? There's people like you and I have talked about the issues. It's not going to change who we are or what we've done. We've already been doing it. But seeing how this quote-unquote silent majority is starting to wake up, do you think that this brings some hope, or you think I'm crazy, that maybe this is going to be the start of men finally using their voices?
Well, yes, I think there is. I do see a silver lining there. I think that is to some extent true, and the way the place you see that is the number of young black men who have been attracted to Trump lately. That's been a lot in the news lately, and of course, black men have been the victims of these injustices much longer than white middle class men. In many ways, the whole family court machinery, the child support enforcement, domestic violence, child abuse, all of this was put in place for the welfare, under the welfare system. That's where this was devised, and it's black men, minority men, low income men who have been much longer suffering with this emasculation, the confiscation of their children, the criminalization through either child support or various other mechanisms. They've been living with this much longer, and they're the ones. If they can be attracted to Donald Trump, then I think that really does say something extremely important when you consider. I mean, that speech he gave the other day in the Bronx, and the way he's attracted men in a place like the Bronx is quite phenomenal. I think that there's a huge. Who's this gentleman? I corresponded with him, Mark Fisher. You might talk to him. He would be a good man for the show.
Okay.
He's the BLM. He was a BLM leader in Baltimore, I think it was, Maryland. And he received some notoriety last summer because he endorsed Trump as a BLM leader. And I guess he's got a breakaway faction now of BLM. But he stood up and he spoke for himself, because when you think of the actual mainstream BLM, if you look at it, it's not men at all. It's run by feminists.
Yes.
And it was created by feminists, it's run by women, and some homosexual groups. And it's not surprising the black men, heterosexual men, are waking up and getting out of BLM. And Mark Fisher was one of the most decisive to do that. So I think there's some, and it's odd because it shows that really one of the most powerless sectors of our society is the black male. I mean, he's demonized by the right, he's demonized by the left. The Democrats despise him, the Republicans despise him, and yet, ironically, I think the black male has a lot of leverage right now. I think if black men were to come out en masse, and against Biden, first of all, and maybe against the Democratic Party as having sold them out, and to be conditionally, and I emphasize conditionally, start supporting the Republican Party, but even make it clear to the Republicans that their vote cannot be taken for granted. That, you know, it's even the Republicans, if you want our vote, you know, you've got to earn it.
Mm-hmm.
I think black men could have a lot of leverage right now in mainstream politics.
I think they've realized that. You know, I've had several black men on this show talking about men's and boys issues, and in some regard, you know, to the destruction of the black family. I mean, you go back to the early 60s, I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like 85 to 90% of black children were raised in two-parent families, and now it's reversed almost exactly. And I think that, you know, in speaking with black men, which I do frequently, I think you're right. I think they've realized that they do have a voice. And ultimately, they may be the ones that determine the election coming up. You know, they're saying somewhere around 20% of the entire black population is now backing Trump / the Republicans, which is a huge turnaround because it used to be 7, 6, 7, 8%. But again, it goes back to, I think it's bodes well for men and men's issues and boys' issues, because once they find that voice and, for lack of a better term, the courage to speak out, I think they're going to start seeing changes, and then it's going to snowball. Which brings me to the next thing I wanted to kind of talk to you about, which is, you know, and you've talked about it in a couple of your books as well, the crisis of masculinity, right? We've emasculated men in my lifetime. You know, as I said earlier, I'm 61 years old. You know, I grew up when whatever wave number feminism you want to apply to it, second, third, fourth, I don't even know anymore, started really snowballing, and, you know, it was demonizing men to do so. But now we're at a point now where men, I argue, men don't know how to be men anymore. Hey fans, I just wanted to take a quick break from the show to remind you just how much we here at Men Need to Be Heard truly appreciate and value your support. And we'd like to ask you to do us a little favor. Could you take a moment and give us that like and share this video with your friends? And hey, don't forget to give us a comment and let us know how we're doing. Your feedback means the world to us, and it helps us to continue bringing great guests and even more content each and every week. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. It's the best way to stay up to date with all of our latest discussions, interviews, and deep dives, as well as it helps the channel to grow so that we can continue to raise even more awareness on the issues men and boys face in today's modern society. So hit that subscribe button and become part of the Men Need to Be Heard community. All right, that's it for now. Back to the show. Men, I argue men don't know how to be men anymore, and I want to get some of your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, very true. I mean, I talked about this in my new book quite a lot. The final chapter is on. It's called "Emasculated America," and I discussed this this phenomenon in some detail, and it's it is very serious, and it's manifests itself in a number of different ways. It's you know, again, this is an old theme in African American literature. You go back to you know, Richard Wright and James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison. They were talking about emasculation, you know, decades ago. Mm. So you know, there again, it's you know, it started in the black community to some extent, and you know, the emasculation of low income men. Now, more recently, the emasculation of you know, middle-class men and the, you know, the loss of especially of their children. I mean, there's nothing more emasculating than that. That's the most tangible, you know, measurement of emasculation. And then, but another measurement, which I talk about in my new book, is the emasculation of the Republican Party. You know, and their fear, their cowardice. At their inability to stand up to not only the feminists, but the left generally. Tucker Carlson made a brief little private video a year ago or so on this, in which he ridicules Republican men for their for being cowards, basically. Phyllis Schlafly used to do this. I knew Phyllis Schlafly well. She used to, whenever she would talk about Republican politicians, the first word that came out of her mouth was cowards. She would call them cowards. So, you know, this is just another, and these are the same men who talk about, you know, manhood and man up and and they write books like Josh Hawley's book on men and a number of others. I can't remember them offhand. And they're all going on about Ward Cleaver and Leave It to Beaver and all these, television images of masculinity and so forth. And yet, they're in some ways they're the biggest cowards of all. They're the biggest sheep.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you on that. It's funny. I'm kind of chuckling behind the scenes. My term for them is feckless and weak. Right? They'll talk the talk, but when it comes time to actually doing anything, they're not going to do it. The radio show that I do, which is political, it's not available online. Sorry, folks, it's local radio. My partner on that show is the head of the Republican Party in my area. So him and I'm more like, I lean libertarian mostly. Him and I go at it sometimes, and I always back him in the corner by saying, you say they're going to do something, show me one instance in the last 40 years when they've done anything. It might be on a men's issue. It might be family court. It might be some other political issue. When it comes time to walk the walk instead of talking the talk, they don't do it. And I do think in some ways, your terminology was perfect, the emasculation of the party, right? They're so afraid of the women in the women's groups that they won't do anything to raise their ire. And they'll sacrifice literally an entire sex to do so. And one of the arguments that I've been making to politicians is, with regard to masculinity, is how do you define it now? Because my position is men don't know how to define it anymore, right? You talk about, Leave It to Beaver. You talk about any, Homer Simpson, any of the fathers that are out there. There's all these thoughts, but if you sit down with a man and say, how do you define what being a man is? They'll look at you like, I don't know. What do you think a man is? I guess is the question I should ask.
Yeah, it is difficult nowadays because everything is called into question. Even things like the concept of chivalry, for example, is very difficult. This was traditionally a part of masculinity that a lot of people never questioned. But nowadays, it's kind of cheap chivalry, and traditionally chivalry was supposed to involve risks and dangers and cost something. Mm-hmm. But nowadays, the chivalry is very cheap. It's very it involves more like pandering to women and pandering to feminists. So it's is chivalry something, an ideal that men should hold? My Catholic friends say it is. My other men tend not to say so. They think the medieval view of chivalry, for example, or the worship of Mary in the Catholic Church is emasculating. So there's a lot of divisions on that, even within the conservative Christian communities, and it is difficult. So a lot of people hold up these ideals of masculinity, like John Wayne and Arnold Schwarzenegger. But if you look at a lot of the traditional ones, like someone like Humphrey Bogart, for example. Mm-hmm. Now Humphrey Bogart, he didn't hesitate to when he was being fed a line by some woman, he would call her on it. Look at a film like The Big Sleep or something. Mm-hmm. He didn't take any back talk from women. So it's, our views of masculinity tend to be very selective, very men. Our pundits, our professional spokesmen, they select what they want. They select what's safe. What's the
what's safe for that day, though, right? One of the arguments that I make is it's so fluid depending on how the wind blows, right? So, you talk about chivalry. I got a beautiful example for you. So, one of the things that I do often on, say, TikTok or Instagram is I take a woman's video and I play off of it. And I have a video coming out where she's in, I think, a New York City subway, and all the men are sitting down and she's standing, and she's like, where did chivalry go? Why aren't the men standing up? And my argument's going to be on that. They're giving you exactly what you told them you wanted, which is you can do anything a man can, treat you like a man, treat you the same. And now we're doing that. And now you're upset by that, right? So today, chivalry's a good thing, right? You want us to be chivalrous. Tomorrow, though, if we were to get up and give you that seat, you'll scream and yell at us, for daring to presume you needed to sit down or opening doors or whatever. And I think I talk to a lot of younger men, and they are so confused by that. They don't know what to do. They're paralyzed by it. And that's why they're kind of walking away from society is, no matter what I do, I'm going to be wrong. So the best option for me to stay home, play video games, and order Domino's pizza.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an understandable response. I think it's the wrong response. That's why I wrote a book. I wrote a book for my Gentleman's Guide. I wrote a guidebook. The old genre that's been around since the Middle Ages of advice books to men, advice books to gentlemen. These developed in the Renaissance mostly and since. And I wrote one of my own a couple of years ago. And I tried to say basically to men, you can't let these things bother you. You can't let them, you've got to take the ideals of masculinity that are tried and true and have been tested over the centuries, and you have to just apply them. And, you don't have to worry. One of those is you just don't worry about what people think of you. You do what's right, and you don't worry if some feminist thinks that it's wrong. There's some places where you have to adjust the ideals for the modern day, but you've got to be very careful about what you're doing. And I mean, to be fair, there are some women who never asked for the feminism, who would like men to be chivalrous and traditional, and they never asked for the feminist ideal, and yet they have to suffer for it. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily their fault either, but what that means is that all of us, men and women, have to kind of band together and just make sure and just marginalize the feminists and make sure that this nonsense is put behind us, because it's not gonna gonna benefit anybody.
Well, there's an interesting point that you make, and I'm on social media a lot. I'm starting to see more and more women speaking out, saying exactly what you're saying, is they aren't speaking for us. Feminism is not the ideal that we hold. And I think, to be fair, they're struggling, I would argue, more than the men, because at least the men, they walk away. They'll say, I'm done. I'll go play video games. Women are far more social than men are. Men are, they can handle being alone a little bit better. Some would disagree with me on that, but I generally think that's true. Whereas women are far more social, and they're feeling abandoned. I talk to several of those women all the time, and they'll reach out to me and say, I saw your video where you're pointing this out, and that a feminist said, and they don't speak for me. And my argument to them is, I can say it till I'm blue in the face. It's you that needs to say it. Yeah, but yet, when they do, to be fair to them, they get savaged. I mean, I have several women who speak out on men's and boys' issues. What I deal with on a daily basis, what you've dealt with and deal with, is nothing compared to what they go through. They literally get death threats. One recently had someone show up at her door, and it was a woman, and absolutely berserk woman. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, as a man, how do we support those women? I try to, and I think I fail at it, to be blunt. I'm not sure exactly the best way to do it. So let me ask you, as someone who's studied this stuff, how do you think I can best support them?
Well, that's an interesting question, because you're right. Women can be the most savage persecutors of other women. And I've argued myself. I've said oftentimes that the courts and the injustice of the men will change when the women start complaining about it. The women are complaining; they can't find husbands. The men don't want to marry, don't want to have children, don't want to start families. And the women are the ones that have to stand up and say, when the women start complaining about this, then things will start to change. But having said that, you're right. The women can, unless they are united, unless they stand together, they can be the victims of this as well, and they are. Pearl Davis on the Twitter is a good example of that. The YouTube, and others. And so you're right. It's very difficult. Uh, and I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, except that the men and women have to stand together. You look at it, the women who were doing the persecuting and the name calling, the death threats, they're really actually a tiny number of women. It's not very many of them. They're just determined, and they're well organized,
And
and
very
they're
vocal.
connected with and they're vocal, and they're connected with the media and with the universities and with business and with cultural institutions, and they get support. Um, so I mean, I don't know that there's a solution other than that we all have to show some courage, and stand up for one another.
Yeah, it's something I struggle with, and I've always argued it's a small number of women that are in that feminist line. Just out of curiosity, just kind of popped my bed. What number? If I said to you, what number percentage would you put on it? What do you think is the percentage of, let's call it, the feminists that are out there? I'm just out of curiosity.
Well, that's really impossible to say because it's a matter of degree, and there's
Right.
many people that say I'm not a feminist. Women who say I'm not a feminist, but I accept this and I accept that. And the ignorance about the family court situation and the child custody is pervasive. It's women and men are who to whom it has not happened, who have not experienced it personally, are often quite ignorant. One of the things I fault the men's movement for, the fathers movement, is for not prioritizing things. Because I believe that the child custody, the family courts, the welfare system, all of the issues dealing with child custody and the stealing of children from fathers, I think this is the number one priority. It's the only thing that's ultimately important. All of the other injustices to men, I think, are secondary, even trivial compared to that one. And I think if men made that their number one priority, that would help, bring attention to it much, much faster. Both among, because it's very hard for people who have not experienced it to understand just how unjust and savage the family courts are, and the welfare system and the social workers, and all these bastions of the radical feminist left. So, the more attention that can be brought to that, the better.
Again, I hate to agree with you on everything, but I'm going to, because I have long argued that shared parenting, or fixing the mindset towards custody, is the only issue right now that men should be addressing as far as that goes, right? Because until you fix that, who cares about child support? You got to fix that first. And so one of the arguments when we were lobbying in New York for shared parenting, we had many guys go, it's not good enough. It doesn't do this. It doesn't do that. And we always argued saying, this is a huge elephant. We're not going to fix it all in one bill. You have to choose one thing, and let's try and get that through first. And then we'll worry about the other stuff, because the dominoes will start falling into place once we do that. But that is the problem with the men's movement, is that it's so fractured, and they can't seem to focus on one issue and stay there. It's right now false allegations, which are a legitimately huge issue, have bubbled up to the top. I'm getting more response from people on that than anything else. I wanted to get your thoughts on that whole paradigm, and the Me Too movement, and how that's going and how it's affecting society and relationships.
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very topical question because, yes, you're right. The false allegations of in the old days it used to be child abuse, but much more nowadays it's domestic violence. And this has hurt. Obviously hurts men. It's a device to get their children away from them and get them out of their homes. And it's a terrible injustice, and it needs to be prioritized. And more than that, it's also one that has spread to the larger society. I mean, you talked about the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement targeting, celebrities, politicians like Judge Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice, or Bill Cosby, or the Prince of York, or any of the prominent politicians who have been accused of, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual assault. Why does this happen? Well, it happens because it's so successful in family court. The feminists found that they could get rid of inconvenient men by accusing them of domestic violence. And this is what they discovered in family court. If you want to get rid of your child's father and you don't want him around, the way to do it is accuse him of domestic violence or child abuse, but usually domestic violence. Well, that was so spectacularly successful that Me Too grew up and started using it for other people, for high-profile politicians like Brett Kavanaugh or Bill Cosby or the Prince of York or any number of these other, or Donald Trump or, So if you want to understand where this came from, it came from the fact that the society refused to address an injustice. You cannot quarantine injustice, after all. You cannot subject part of your population to injustice and expect the rest of the population to enjoy justice. Martin Luther King pointed this out again, the civil rights movement. King said an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Mm-hmm. You can't treat part of your population with systematic injustice and expect it to be confined just to them. And so this is what happened. That, men in custody, fathers in custody cases were subjected to these obviously, flagrantly trumped up accusations of domestic violence to get them thrown out of their homes, to get their children taken away, to get child support orders against them. And this worked so beautifully that the feminists started using it against conservative politicians and liberal politicians and celebrities and you name it. So, if you don't like it, maybe we should have addressed it and nipped it in the bud when they started using it in the family courts. Mm-hmm. This is what's happening for us, and yet they don't. If you want to look at if you want to look at what's happening to Donald Trump, look at what's been happening to fathers and men in family court for the last 25 years or more, and you've got your explanation there, and yet they won't do it. Alan Dershowitz won't do it. Jonathan Turley won't do it. None of them will do it. They won't point this out, and so the problem persists, and the problem gets worse. And it's just going to get worse until you go back and look at where it came from, what caused it, and root it out. And yet, even the MAGA Republicans don't want to do this because they're terrified of the bar associations, mm-hmm. and they're terrified of the feminists in their own ranks, even feminists within the Republican Party or the feminists within the conservative organizations, the conservative feminists within the churches. The women within in the most conservative churches. This is another of the fruits of emasculation.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about the conservative women, the MAGA women, is having spoken to them, and I speak to all across the political spectrum when it comes to men's and boys' issues, and one of the arguments I would make is the conservative women are the most damaging to men's issues because they have their blinders on as much as, let's say, the far left does with regards to men's and boys' issues. But at least with the left, where they stand. The conservative women are more silent about it. They're like silent ninja assassins. They will torpedo. We're trying to get a shelter open for men in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm working on, behind the scenes because I want to get one in North Carolina at some point. And where I'm getting the most pushback is Republican women. And I'm like,
yeah,
why? Where does it benefit you as a Republican to say that men don't deserve help? And, they don't want to answer that question. But they're so silent. They're ninja-like is the term I'll use with it. And I think it creates far more issues than the more overt, quote unquote stereotypical feminists that's out there screaming, the blue hair, purple hair, whatever hair color they have this week. And I think it's damaging not just men, but society as a whole. Would you agree?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, I like to go back to Phyllis Schlafly. She was one of the very, very prominent, powerful Republican anti-feminist woman back in the the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and right up until her death just a few years ago. And I think she was voted at one point one of the 20 most important women in the world or something, and one of the most important influential Americans. And yet, when she took this up, she did take this up. Her son was victimized in family court by this. He lost his children, and she took this up. And she contacted me, and we worked together a bit on it. And she said the biggest opposition she came across was from her own organization. She headed this huge organization, Eagle Forum, and they had chapters in every state. And she said that her biggest blowback, the biggest pushback she got, was from the women in the local chapters when she tried to criticize the family courts. And it's just, here's one of the most important and powerful and influential women in American history. And she was, they didn't hesitate to trash her. I saw her try to bring this up once with Senator Rick Santorum. I stood there next to her. Mm-hmm. She brought this up to Senator Rick Santorum, was a U.S. senator who was pushing for family values. He created an organization. He made himself a champion of family values, and he just ignored her. He just humiliated her in the most ruthless manner. I've never seen. I really realized that the man was a complete fraud when I saw that happen. And this, I see a lot of this in the conservative movement. It's amazing. These organizations like the Family Research Council and Focus on the Family. They're just they have no regard for the family whatsoever. They're just unbelievable.
Yeah, it begs the question because one of the things that I've often put out is there's so little funding to help men, whether it's regard to family court, mental illness, homelessness, the list goes on. What little funds that, let's say, through grants or other means that the government or organizations provide, tends to go to those groups, though, and they don't do anything with it. That's why I say they're far more damaging than those who are so vocally opposed and don't hide what they're doing. And right. I guess the question I have for you is, how do we get them to wake up? I mean, is it so political that they can't, or it's to their benefit not to? Or
it's to their benefit not to. Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of them are full of lawyers, lobbyists, and lawyers who are part of the bar associations who collect child support. They have connections with people like the state attorneys general and like Josh Hawley and the state governments who are making money hand over fist on child support enforcement. And so they have pecuniary interests in it, and so they're never going to wake up. They simply need to be. I point out in my new book they don't even the battles they take up. The battles against same-sex marriage or the battles against the homosexual agenda or transgenderism, they lose every battle. They lose every battle they engage in. Mm-hmm. They can't win anything. So, the best thing is to stop sending them money, stop supporting them, stop giving them any credence. They're so slick. Example that I gave you, recently I heard a woman named Mary Eberstadt, who claims to be one of these champions of the family. She was talking in a public forum, and some woman asked her a question about all of the injustices against men and the injustices of family court and the terrible things that go on with fathers. And Eberstadt took her question and she said, she said, "Oh, I couldn't agree with you more." And then she restated the question in such a way that it blamed the men. It made the men sound like the men were, abandoning their children and nothing about the courts, nothing about the welfare agencies. And she just restated the whole thing in such a self-serving way. So, and too many men and women are taken in by this. They think these people are the champions of families when they're not. They're simply not. And, they mustn't be, unless they come around, and there's a few that might if they have the incentive to do it. But, until they do, until they show some good faith, they really aren't deserving of anyone's trust anymore.
Do you think we've reached a point where it is irreversible, or that, like you said, we might get some change, but we're not going to see anything major? Do you think we've reached that point? That's a great question.
Well, yeah, there is a certain stubbornness about all of this. I mean,
Mm.
like I said, the Republican Party does nothing but lose, and yet they just keep doing the same thing. This is kind of one of the themes of my new book. The conservative groups, generally, all conservative groups of all kind, do nothing but lose. They lose every battle, and yet they keep doing the same thing. The specific conservative groups that deal with the family and sexuality and these sorts of things, they lose every battle, and yet they keep doing the same thing. I don't know where they're getting their money these days because they do nothing but lose. So I don't know why anybody would support them. I guess they get money from foundations and, like you say, sometimes even the federal government. Um, but they do nothing but lose. So maybe this is a good thing. I mean, maybe this is the fact that they can't win any battles, and people will start realizing it. I did review a book recently. A book did come out from the Claremont Institute, and they even admitted this. It was full of a dozen or so essays from various scholars. And the theme of the book was basically not just the Republican Party, but the conservative movement generally, they lose every battle. And they do. So, but they didn't seem to have any remedies for it. They didn't seem to have any
Yeah,
solution.
it's again, it goes back to they talk the talk, but they never walk the walk. And I mean,
Yeah.
again, I'm biased. I'm a man. I fight on men's and boys issues, as do you. I got to believe if I'm a head of the Republican Party or a conservative group or whatever, I would be embracing this stuff, not giving it lip service. I would say, pick an issue. We're going to ensure that there's a domestic violence shelter or help for men in every state. We're going to fix education so that boys aren't lagging behind. We're going to address fatherlessness. We're going to do it. They'll talk the talk all day long, but they never want to fix it. And they'll throw gobs of money, God knows where it's going, never getting any results. And what I'm seeing, and again, this goes back to social media, the average person's got more of a voice now, and it's percolating under the surface. And I would love to sit down with Mark Meadows or somebody in the Republican Party and say, we wake up. Do you realize that there is this huge swath, men and women, by the way, that would love to come out and support an organization that is going to fix and address some of these issues? Because I hate to break it to you, but for every boy, there's a mom who birthed them and cares about them. But they just will not do it. And, the definition of insanity, right? They just keep repeating it over and over again. And I ask, at what point do you think they'll wake up? I don't think they will, but because it's just getting worse by the day.
Well, I do think there is one. I do see one hope, and that is we alluded to this earlier at the beginning. The men who are just giving up, the men who are just the MGTOW men, the men going their own way, the men who are basically engaged in an impromptu, spontaneous boycott of marriage and family and women and children, and just refusing to take part. And this is sending the conservative groups, especially apoplectic. It's making them, they're vilifying the men, they're ranting, they're raving Josh Hawley and these televangelists, and they're just demonizing the men for not having families and not starting. Well, the men aren't going to do it. All the scolding, nobody ever got anywhere by scolding people, and it's not going to happen. And I myself do not endorse this MGTOW thing. There's a good book about it, by the way. Helen Smith wrote a book a few years ago called The Marriage Strike. And
I remember that. Yes, I've read that book. Excellent book.
Excellent book, and it really deserves attention because she pointed this out. She wasn't the first. A couple of some journalists had been pointing it out. Glenn Sachs and some others had pointed this out in newspapers, and then Helen wrote this excellent book, which I think should be front page these days because it explains all of it. And she showed very clearly the reason for it: the injustices of the family courts, the injustices of the welfare agencies and the social workers, and all this. And I don't endorse this, but what I do think I don't endorse this as a lifestyle, as a permanent lifestyle option for men. I think men should and want to have families, procreate within marriage, marry women, have children within the bonds of wedlock, raise those children, and propagate the species and continue the civilization. In principle, that's what they should do. So I don't favor this, boycotting this, except insofar as any strike, the purpose of any strike is to change the law, to change it, to deal with a grievance and to change an injustice. So I don't agree with this boycott if it's an indefinite, if it's open-ended and it goes on forever. This is wrong. But if it's used as leverage to change the law, to reform the courts, to reform the welfare system, then I think it's a perfectly justifiable and understandable strategy.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I'm an advocate for men walking away right now, but it's for the exact reason you're talking about. It's to send the message. I believe if men don't walk away, nothing's going to change. But if enough of them walk away, that birth rates decline, society starts collapsing.
Women can't find husbands.
It's going to create such an uproar that men will finally be heard. I agree with you completely. As a long-term solution strategy, no, it's not good for men. It's not good for women. It's not good for society. We need to be together. But I think at least in the next 20 to 50 years, that's what men need to do. It's not going to change overnight. They're showing now, the data is showing that by 2030, well over half of women are going to be alone and childless. That's when it's really going to start hitting home. But I do think we've reached a point where men have to do that. And as opposed to, say, a violent type uprising, which I would never suborn, this is a way for men to send that message. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This is how men can bring about change, right? Is by saying, we're done. We're going to walk away. You figure it out now, because you don't want to listen to us. You don't want to hear what we're saying. So we're going to let you figure it out. And then you'll come back to us ready to listen. And that's what I'm a strong advocate for, with the understanding, though, that this needs to be temporary, because long term, it's not good for the human species, let alone any particular society.
No, that's precisely true. And I think it can have larger benefits for our society too. I mean, my next book is going to be about the whole, the last 4 years of mainstream politics and how the left has taken over politics. And I'm not the only one. A number of people have written books and articles about this. And yet all of them, conservatives especially, and the conservatives, they can't come up with any solution. They say that the left is taking over everything. The left is taking over the United States, the woke ideology, and the left is just we've lost and they've won, and yet they cannot come up with any solution because they don't want to look at the causes of it. And my argument is, if you want a solution, you look at what people are doing spontaneously anyway, and you try to guide that spontaneous action into constructive ends. And I think that's what we should all be doing. The men who are engaged in this spontaneous strike of marriage and the family, they should be encouraged, but they should be encouraged to channel that withdrawal, not a withdrawal, but to channel it into constructive, as you just said, constructive reform. Mm-hmm. And then we have the solution. I think it could have ramifications for our entire society, not just for men. And this is why I think men are the ones who need to be society's natural leaders. This is always the way it has been, and this is just another example that this is always the way it will be.
And women in general agree with that. Feminists don't, but most women want men to lead. I mean, I hear it literally daily. I mean, there isn't a day that goes by I don't get an email or a direct message or some sort of communication from a woman going, keep doing what you're doing because we do need men to lead. And, I put myself out there saying that, Media Matters will now clip this and say I hate women and all that because that's what they do, but I don't care, right? But I guess where I want to go next with it is, because we're getting short on time, is, I mentioned like that 20 to 50 year period. Where do you see things, in the next, say, 20 to 50 years? Do you think men will continue to be marginalized? Do you think that they'll finally be heard? Where do you see it going?
Well, like I said, I'm encouraged by this marriage strike. This stuff and the response of it to it by the conservative groups. I mean, they're tearing their hair out, and I mean, it's a kind of a stupid response,
Yeah,
but
to
at
say the
least it's a
least.
response. It's a response at least, and maybe if the rest of us can help the men, channel it into constructive, they need to be quoted. I mean, we need alternative media like this one, where people will say, I think this is the only solution is alternative media like this, where these things can be said, because it won't be said in the mainstream media. It won't be said in even the conservative media, like Fox News. You won't find it there. This is the only hope is to use the social media, the conservative media, to point out common sense. And I think there's a very good. I think it could happen quite quickly.
Okay.
Women are very upset that they can't find husbands, they can't get have children, at least married. Children within the bounds, the bonds of wedlock, and they're upset. I think once they start speaking out as a group, they will. I think things will change. So there's no reason to. The churches also, I think, could rejuvenate themselves. I think the churches have nothing to lose and everything to gain by embracing this. And yet these silly televangelists go on there and they just rip apart men as if they themselves are not sinners and the only fathers are the only sinners in the world.
Yeah.
And that women are sinless and televangelists are sinners and Republican Party members are sinless, I should say. They're all exempt from the status of sinners. But the churches could be. I mean, the churches have lost extremely all of their authority because of their failure to do this. It used to be the churches were the ones that filled the void when it came to, marriage breakdown, family breakdown. The churches were the first avenue of redress, and they deserted that turf, and that vacuum was filled by legal practitioners. Lawyers, judges, social workers, psychotherapists. If the churches would refill that turf, they would have everything to gain, and their pews would fill back up again, because people would see that they have some practical value in the world. But all they do is rant on about the loss of Judeo-Christian values and the loss of religious faith, and woe is me and woe is us, and the world's ending and the sky is falling, and all they do is lament and bemoan and cry and wring their hands, and nobody pays any attention to them. And why should they?
Yeah, I mean, I am agnostic as hell. I'm not against any religion, but I'm like, I have no respect for any religions either, for the exact reasons you're talking about. Is they don't practice what they preach, pun intended, right? Is they, we're going to preach Judeo-Christian values. We're going to say this, we're going to say that. But when, again, push comes to shove, they don't want to do it. They're so afraid of upsetting the people that are never going to go to church, that they turn off the people that might.
Want them to go to church.
Yes. I mean, it blows my mind to see that. And you see it with politicians as well. And I mean, it speaks to where we're at as a society, that a very small group is controlling everything. Unfortunately, they control the media and all that, and they're controlling the narrative by doing that. Dr. Baskerville, one other question I have before we kind of wrap things up is, what can the average man, in your opinion, do to kind of advance the talk about men's issues or these issues that society's facing? If you were speaking to someone out on the street who said, what's one or two or three things that I could do to at least start moving things forward, what would you say to them?
I would say patronize the alternative media like this one, like your show. Make sure recirculate it, repost it. Use all of your social media connections to recirculate things. Look at the books that people like I have written. Janice Fiamingo's site, Greg Ellis's recent book. My books are pretty good about citing other people's books. So if you look in my books, you'll find footnotes to some of the others, or my Substack or my webpage, stephenbaskerville.com. I tend to cite other people's that I think are very good on these, other writers like Janice Fiamingo and Greg Ellis and Tom Golden, and Paul Elam and some of these others. There's a lot of chaff, cut through the chaff, the he said, she said, these endless discussions about who's victimized more, and this is really pointless. But make sure that you use patronize the alternative media, the alternative journalists, the scholars, and people like me who are writing books like this, and make sure you circulate these things as much as you can on the social media and the alternative media. So that's all we have. That's all there is. So the more we create a critical mass of important voices, because there's a cacophony right now. You can have a million views of a video or Twitter, but it's just clicking like or having your comments. It doesn't it doesn't achieve any change. You need to get a critical mass of people whose names become familiar. And again, I would look at Janice Fiamingo, Paul Elam, Tom Golden, Mike Buchanan's group in Britain, and some of the others.
And yourself. I mean, I'm going to throw it out there.
My website also.
And I'm not saying that because you're sitting here with me. I highly encourage everyone to go read Dr. Baskerville's books, because Taken into Custody, which is 15 years old, is just as valid and germane and just a wealth of information now as it was when you first wrote it. And it was one of those books. Warren Farrell's probably my number one hero. You're like 1A behind him. But the point I want to make with it is, you're just not spouting things. It is all supported. It is documented. You've got research behind it. And it's logical, okay? It's not just propaganda type bullet point narratives. It's when you read it with a critical mind, an open mind, you will understand. And I encourage everyone to go get the books. You have multiple books out, but you have a new one coming out. I just wanted to give you a few minutes to kind of talk about that. And then, of course, we've already kind of talked about it, but I'm going to have you back on once it really comes out and we can really go into that one in depth. But can you kind of share with the audience a little bit about your upcoming book? Because it's going to be released very shortly, correct?
Yeah, probably this month, actually, from Arctos. So it'll be up on Amazon soon. There's a trailer on my website. It's basically, I'm trying to go into mainstream politics in the last 4 years in the United States and show how what's happened here, this capture, this coup d'etat, which has taken place by the far left in the U.S., is really the result, the logical conclusion of what's been going on in the welfare system and the family courts for decades, and it's just spreading out to the entire society. And this is what my Taken into Custody was concerned with fathers. My next book, The New Politics of Sex, was concerned with the whole sexual radicalism phenomenon, and this one is concerned with mainstream politics. So that just shows that the ramifications of all of this is much wider than most people realize. So we need to show that this is not just confined to a few injustices against men and fathers. It's destroying our entire society very, very rapidly. Mm-hmm. So this is the argument of the book, and I think it's struck a nerve already. I just got an endorsement from the former president of the Czech Republic, is on our website in a commentary on the book. So hopefully it'll get some notice.
Is it available for pre-order yet? I did not look.
I don't think it is. Okay. I've been talking to publishers about doing that, but if you send me an email on my website, I will compile a list of pre-orders myself.
Well, I'll put down in the show notes links to whatever I can so that people can go find it, and your other books as well. One final question. So as we're wrapping things up and we come to a close, any final thought or message that you'd like to leave with the listeners with regards to any of the things that we've talked about or anything we didn't talk about?
Well, just never give up, because I think I think there is reason for optimism now. and show your appreciation for shows like this one, because I think this is what we need. And as the Puritans used to say, pray, but don't stop after you've prayed. Then you have to do. So
Love that.
that's it's not really, you're not really praying unless you do unless afterwards you do. So this is what, and one of the best things you can do is patronize the alternative media and the social media.
Excellent. And if people wanted to follow you or reach out to you, that you have your website. Are you on social media at all?
I'm on Substack.
Okay.
If you go to my website, stephenbaskerville.com, you can click a link to my Substack, which has a lot of my recent articles. And there's information on the website about my books, all my books, including the new one, and my recent articles. So Stephen with a PH, stephenbaskerville.com.
And I'll put links down in the show notes so people can just go there, click on it, and head on over to your website. Dr. Baskerville, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts and wisdom. As I said earlier, I have admired you for many years, and it's truly been an honor for me to have you on and talk to you. And I look forward to meeting and talking with you in the future when the new book comes out, which I can't wait to read myself. So thank you for your time and for all you've done over the years to raise awareness on men's and boys' issues.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. What an awesome show. And as I said earlier, I highly encourage you to go read all of Dr. Baskerville's books. I am partial to Taken into Custody. It's one that changed my life and helped me to become a better advocate for men and boys' issues. And I say that as someone who's read many books on these matters. If you've enjoyed the show, do me a favor. Give me that thumbs up. Give me that like. Because as Dr. Baskerville said, we need to spread the word more. Share this. And if you aren't a subscriber to the channel, why not? Subscribe to the channel. New shows go out every Sunday at 11 a.m. Don't forget, also, I am live with my partner, Squirrely Girl, whose real name is Lindsay, every Wednesday from 4 to 5:30, and we talk about men's and boys' issues. That show is on TikTok, YouTube, Spotify. There's many areas. Links are below. You can go find them there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on Men Need to Be Heard.